Great. Good evening and welcome to our special meeting this March 20th at 5 p.m. Moved by Martin Lang, seconded by Trevor Bougie. Be it resolved that the March 20th, 2023 special council meeting of the Township of South Glengarry now be opened at 5 p.m. All those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, carried. Be it resolved by, moved by Trevor Bougie, seconded by Sam McDonnell. Be it resolved that the Council of the Township of South Glengarry approve the agenda as circulated. Are there any amendments required? Don't think. All those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, carried. Great. All right. One thing, Councillor Jaworski had a meeting, so she'll probably be a few minutes late, but she's intending to be here shortly thereafter 5. Pass it off to you, Ms. Haley.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. Thank you very much for allowing us to have a special meeting of Council this evening to discuss our floodplain mapping project. This project has been in the making for quite some time, so we're very pleased to be here this evening and to tell you everything we can about floodplains. I'd like to introduce you to Phil Barnes. Phil is beside me this evening. Phil is the team lead for water resource management for the Raisin Region Conservation Authority. He's also a professional engineer. Phil and I work very closely together. We probably would speak multiple times a week on various different development proposals, redevelopment proposals. So I'm really glad that Phil is with us this evening, and honestly, we could not have done this project without him. So we'll get started. Our goal today is for council to leave this meeting knowing as much as you possibly can about floodplains in South Glengarry. So we'd like our meeting to be interactive. Please feel free to ask questions, interrupt. Tonight is about learning as much as we can. And I hope that when we're finished, that you have an understanding of what a floodplain is, what our floodplain mapping is, why and how we enforce floodplain, and what it means to our residents and how it impacts our residents. So if we're not kind of getting to that point and you have questions, please interrupt us along the way. So I'm going to get started. And some of this is going to be quite technical, so hopefully we don't make it too boring. We're going to start off with floodplain mapping. And our purpose of our floodplain mapping project was to look at lands adjacent to watercourses, and this is a definition coming from the provincial policy statement, where lands adjacent to watercourses are zoned as either floodplain, floodplain holding, or natural hazard. I'm just going to double check something here. Okay. Thank you. I thought maybe I skipped a slide. So our floodplain mapping is lands adjacent to watercourses that are zoned either floodplain, floodplain holding, or natural hazard. And these lands are determined by the floodplain mapping produced by the province of Ontario and are incorporated into the township zoning bylaw. So what is a watercourse? This definition comes from the provincial policy statement that's from the province of Ontario. It means a natural channel where water is flowing continuously or intermittently, possessing a bed and banks, and where it usually discharges into a storm or water body. Now I'm going to review the definition of a floodplain. It means the area, usually lowlands, adjoining a watercourse, and a watercourse again is a river, stream, or small inland lake system, which has been or may be subject to flooding hazards. And then, that's a little harder to read. So our next one is the definition of what a flooding hazard is. And it means the inundation of areas adjacent to a shoreline or a river or stream system and not ordinarily covered by water. So one, along the shores of the St. Lawrence River system, the flooding hazard limit is based on the 100-year flood levels plus an additional allowance for wave uprush and other hazards. And Phil's going to speak to that later. And two, it's along rivers and streams, and the flooding hazard limit is the greater of flood resulting from rainfall or weather events, the 1 in 100-year flood, or a flood that is greater than the above. So now we'll talk about what the 100-year flood is. And that's a term that we use on a regular basis when we're doing our job and looking at the mapping of, we map where the 1 in 100-year flood line is. So it's for rivers and streams means that flood based on analysis of precipitation, snowmelt, or a combination thereof, having a return period of 100 years on average, or having a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And locally, 2014 was a significant high water year, and the return period in that year was 1 in 20 year. And again, we have some more information on that in a few minutes. So I'll turn this over to Phil to explain what this photo is. He brought the interesting parts of the presentation this evening. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so as Joanne explained, recently and locally, the most significant event we have had in the last 20 years or so was in 2014, and that was a significant snow melt. There was some rain and snow melt at the same time, and that caused some relatively minor flooding in our area. Nonetheless, I'll show you some photographs of that. So this is an example of what the 1 in 20 year flood does look like on McGillivray Road. And we know McGillivray Road is one of the lower points in South Glengarry, and actually, practically, this roadway does flood probably on average once every 2 to 3 years. So it certainly did flood in the year 2014, and this was kind of at its peak, and that roadway was out of commission for several days, and traffic had to be rerouted. This is what that same flood looked like upstream, so up in St. Andrews West, just upstream of the 138. Again, there are quite a few low spots on the Raisin River. And again, this is a 1 in 20 year event, and there are several properties that do get, unfortunately, inundated at these flood levels. They were built prior to flood regulations, and this is a regular occurrence that they need to deal with. This is what Grants Corners looks like. So this is just west of the South Glengarry border. And again, this is a relatively low spot. This does get flooded quite often, but this is what it looked like, the 1 in 20 year event. And finally, this is Loyalist Road. So this is an area just downstream of us, and it was quite impacted in 2014. The roadway was completely blocked off. The roadway goes right through the middle of this photograph, and you wouldn't be able to see where it was if you were trying to leave your home, or if you were an ambulance trying to pick somebody up. So I know these homes were isolated for quite some time, and it was a very stressful period for the homeowners in this area. And again, this is only the 1 in 20 year event. So, this is, okay, I have one more in our local area. So this is just at the end of the Raisin River, the mouth of the Raisin River where it meets St. Lawrence. This is the 1 in 20 year event. You can see that it's about a couple inches short of going over that curb there and completely flooding out the marina. And of course we have development and things being stored in there, such as this large fuel tank. So this could be a concern if it were below the 1 in 100 year flood event. And so the golden question is, well, what does the 1 in 100 year flood event look like? We're fortunate that we don't have any pictures of it in our area. But this is what it looked like in the Ottawa region. This was 2019. This was a typical residential neighborhood that is adjacent to the Ottawa River. And well, I think it's quite clear the water came up very high, flooded a lot of homes, caused a lot of damage, a lot of stress. And this is what floodplain mapping is intended to avoid.
So now I'll get into some details specific to South Glengarry. So the floodplains that we have are located along the St. Lawrence River system, and we have zoned those floodplains as a holding zone. So it's called floodplain holding. The reason for that is when we were doing our new zoning bylaw in 2009, we are required to ensure that our zoning bylaw conforms to the official plan and is consistent with the provincial policy statement. The provincial policy statement has policies that pertain to development in floodplains or adjacent to floodplains, filling in floodplains, etc. And we felt that the mapping we had in South Glengarry was very out of date. So for example, the mapping that the province had provided to us, the maps are either dated 1989 or 1991. So a lot has changed on different parcels of property since then. Also, prior to 2005, there was more flexibility about filling properties or changing the grade on properties. So you could imagine what occurred between 1989 and 2005, and even post 2005, people do work on their property not realizing they need approvals. And so there could have been further changes made between 2005 and now. So the purpose of putting it in a holding zone was we worked with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to allow the residents to prove the mapping to either be incorrect or correct. And that's the easiest way for me to explain it from a layman's terms, because it gives the residents the opportunity to retain an Ontario land surveyor, pay to have a topographical survey completed. That survey would then determine or outline where the floodplain is. We would have some surveys come back that would show there was no floodplain on a property. We might have some surveys that would come back and show that the floodplain was in a different location, or we might have surveys that have come back that put the property in an even worse situation where it was entirely in a floodplain even though the map didn't show that. And so that task came at a very expensive cost to our residents. But if they were serious in developing or redeveloping, it was really the only tool they had. So let's say if it came back working in favor for them in terms of less floodplain, then they had an opportunity to go through a land use planning process to remove that holding pattern that would then allow them to obtain a building permit for their new development, subject to review of the Raisin Region Conservation Authority and other permits that may have been required. Moving into other floodplains in South Glengarry, examples of those would be adjacent to the Raisin River, the Baudette River, the DeLille, and all those areas are zoned natural hazard. And the reason why they have a different zoning and they're not held in a holding pattern is because those rivers have a different flooding system, if you will. They have a different impact. And Phil's going to get into that a little bit later, explaining the differences between the two river systems. And so if you had property located adjacent to these rivers, in the natural hazard zone, it said no development, you could obtain a survey. And if the survey came back where the mapping was incorrect, we would then do a full rezoning and your development would proceed. Or if it came back and confirmed, then no development would be permitted in those river systems. So this slide is speaking to why we needed new floodplain mapping. And I know I got into this a little bit, but as I indicated to you, the province provided us our mapping, and again, it was dated between 1989 and 1991. We knew it was very out of date. Not only that, it wasn't meeting the policies that we're required to work with today. So in my career, we've had a 1997 provincial policy statement, followed by a 2005, followed by 2014, and then 2020. So you can see that policies are constantly being reviewed by the province, being reissued. Sometimes there's significant changes, sometimes there's minor changes, and there's not always changes when it comes to flooding. But we felt that we were working with really out-of-date information and that we were always putting it on the requirement of the residents to prove what our mapping was. And that's really not the goal of how our floodplain mapping should work. It's not the goal of how our zoning should work. So here's an example of what the old floodplain mapping looked like. It was a paper copy. Those colored lines, I believe, were hand-colored in. Yeah. So it was done predating computers. We have an employee in our room, Anne Lalonde, who's our planning and GIS technician, and used to be an employee of the Conservation Authority, and it's my understanding that she digitized these maps to bring them into an electronic format, and I'm sure that was not an easy or fun task. But it was a confusing map to read. And even for myself, when I'm working with different developers or property owners, it's not easily understood, and the RCA staff would explain it the best they could, but oftentimes the residents would be confused when they left our office as to which line they were subject to and following. So in 2014, the federal government had earmarked $200 million to establish what was called the National Disaster Mitigation Program. And you're going to hear me refer to that as the NDMP project. And the purpose of that was for the government to commit to build safe and resilient communities. And so the NDMP program was intended to reduce impacts of natural disasters on Canadians with investments focused on reducing significant occurring flood risks and costs and advancing availability of private residential insurance for overland flooding. So the examples that Phil provided using the City of Ottawa photo or even in South Stormont, you can imagine what different homeowners may be subject to from insurance or not being able to get insurance. And then you can imagine what many homeowners went through in the 2017 and 2019 floods that there were the 1 in 20-year events. There was a lot of damage, and we all saw that in the news, and we saw how people were displaced from their homes or, you know, lost so many of their personal belongings. So we attempted to obtain some of this funding. So when you applied for funding, there was 4 streams to the project, and let's get to that slide here. So stream 1 was to do a flood risk assessment. Stream 2 was to obtain up-to-date floodplain mapping. And then stream 3 would get into floodplain mitigation planning, which is more of your emergency planning component. And then stream 4 was to look at non-structural and small-scale structural measures. So we worked or partnered with the RCA, specifically Phil did the work. And we wanted to obtain new floodplain mapping, both from an emergency planning focus as well as a land use planning focus. So we then prepared an application. Honestly, it is the most difficult thing I've ever done in my entire career in South Glengarry was preparing that application. I think it took several years off of my life. It was not an easy application. However, we were successful. And we received $116,000 of funding, which represented 49% of the project. So we filed our application. We were successful in receiving the money. And the first main step of the project was to acquire LiDAR information. If you don't mind, would you explain what that is? Because you do a better job than I do.
Thank you. Well, LiDAR is an acronym, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging. It's a very precise topographical mapping exercise where a special sensor is mounted to an aircraft, and the aircraft flies over a certain flight pattern, many times actually, because it wants to overlap itself. And as it's doing that, it's basically scanning the ground. In layman's terms, it's sort of bouncing a laser off the ground, if you will. When that laser comes back up, it measures the time it takes to bounce back up, and there's a special collection sensor that's able to infer from all the information that it gathers what the actual ground level elevation is. But on top of that, what is the type of ground cover? Is it a hard surface? Is it a soft surface? Is it vegetated, or is it water? And so all of this this data is again, it's captured from an airplane. It's processed with special computers. Generally, what you really need to know is that it's very precise, more precise than you and I could do with typical surveying equipment very quickly. What they're doing is they gather approximately 10 points for every square meter, and the accuracy is within 5 centimeters for hard surfaces. So it's really nice, accurate topographic survey. We're able to create what's called a digital raster, and I think there's an example of that on the next slide. You want to flip to the next slide? So the next slide is showing this digital raster. So we're able to colorize each cell, each piece of data that it returns to us, and we can color it by elevation. So this map here, or this picture here, is showing us what the ground level elevation is in very precise terms with 0.1 meter, so 10 centimeters in difference. And from this information, we're able to quite accurately determine which parts of the ground are above the flood elevation and which parts are below the flood elevation. We can also tell how the water is moving on the ground and how it runs off towards the river and the streams.
Thanks. So the company that did this work was Airborne Imaging, and I understand there's not a lot of companies that do this work, and they were tasked to take images on 48 square kilometers of our river systems. So we were able to capture all of the Raisin and all of the St. Lawrence in South Glengarry through this project. But beyond obtaining the LiDAR, there was a lot more work to the project to be able to get to our mapping stage. So we then issued a request for proposal looking for an engineering firm that had the qualifications to prepare the mapping. And the mapping then involved a variety of components. Following the request for proposal process, we entered into an agreement or retained the services of Dillon Consulting Limited. And they're a professional engineering firm, and they were retained to complete modeling of portions of the St. Lawrence and the Raisin River to determine the flood potential. Do you want to speak to the modeling at this point, or do you have a slide to that?
We have some slides
Okay,
later.
perfect. So the goal of Dillon Consulting Limited was to produce floodplain mapping that delineated the 1 in 100 year flood extent. So that when we're working from an emergency planning perspective or from a land use planning perspective in determining developments, we would then have a newly created line that was up to date, and we weren't relying on that 1989 or 1991 information. And then, to ensure that the modeling they completed and the other work that they completed, we had to have it peer reviewed. So Phil Barnes did the peer reviewing of the modeling and the work that was completed, and that was a task that was required as part of the funding program. So here's an example of the excerpt of the new final floodplain mapping. And if you were in front of this mapping, you would see a legend that would explain the new floodplain, the old floodplain, and the combination of the new and the old. But the mapping we have is much more easy to read, it's more clear, and because it's digital, it can be utilized in many different formats. And we can share it with engineering firms, we could share it with developers that they could then use that data as well. So we then paid Dillon Consulting to produce floodplain maps to demonstrate the existing and the proposed. That wasn't a requirement of the NDMP project, but we felt it was a requirement for us when we're working with the taxpayers, and it'll be good information for council to understand as well. And with having a visual showing where it used to be and where it is today is helpful, because at the time of pursuing this funding and when working with residents, there is a perception out there that our floodplain mapping was very wrong. It was over-mapped. There wasn't as much floodplain as we thought there was. And it's interesting looking at the final maps how that is not necessarily the case in different areas, and you'll have a chance to see some of that. There was completed as there was oh yeah, I just explained that, I'm sorry. And we talked about as well how we would have so many conversations with residents that the St. Lawrence River system is located between two dams. It's never going to flood. We're never going to have any changes on our waterfront, and that's something that Phil is going to get into.
Thanks. Okay, on this slide, this is a visual representation of the new modeling that the engineering firm, Dillon Consulting, has prepared for us. So this particular computer model uses hydrologic information. So what is the shape of the land? What is the land cover? How does the land slope towards the water? And it uses meteorological information. So how much rain do we get? How much snow do we get? How does that impact the runoff? So it uses that information to generate a runoff, which is routed through what's called a hydraulic model. So the hydraulic model takes into account how the river, the creeks, all of the little tributaries running into it are physically shaped, and how they may convey water, if they allow water to run off quickly or less quickly. And using this model, they're able to compute the depth of water for flooding for any given return period. So you can have, well, what is the 2-year flood? What is the 5-year flood? What is the 10-year flood? All the way up to the 100-year flood. And in fact now, for climate change considerations, some people are recommending looking at what is a 200-year flood or the 500-year flood. That's not a regulatory flood. The regulatory flood in this case is the 100-year flood, and so we do have that information. But we do also have this model, so we can run the model under various future scenarios as well and generate that information if need be. So they built this computer model, and the question that will most likely get asked the most is, well, how accurate is it? And as part of any modeling exercise, computer modeling exercise, there's a calibration and a validation exercise. And so this is what they've done. So they've run various scenarios of actual measured events. So we have stream gauges along the Raisin River, and we have precipitation gauges, and we have snow depth measurements. So we can feed that information into the model, and we can see how did the model predict what would have run off, and we can compare that prediction to what was actually measured at various historical events. So in this case, I've just chosen 2 to highlight. One is the one on the left is the computerized, there's 2 lines on the chart. It's the model discharge versus the observed discharge for a particular snowmelt event. And it's very difficult to see, but there are 2 lines, and they're quite coincident, meaning they're one on top of the other. In other words, the modeled result was very accurate. It was practically the same as the observed result. The graph on the right-hand side is a similar calibration and validation exercise for a rainfall event. So it's showing the observed discharge, so how much water was actually observed through the sensors, the stream gauges installed in the river versus what the computer model predicted. And again, it's very similar. You can see that the peaks are the same, the rise and the fall are the same. So these are very satisfactory calibration results. So we can be very confident that the model is accurate and able to accurately predict the flows and therefore the regulatory floods for the Raisin River. This is just a zoomed-in picture of the model detail. This you won't maybe recognize it looking at this, but this is near McGillivrays Bridge, and all of those green lines they correspond to cross sections that are inputted into the computer model. The sort of brown and orange blobs behind represent the LiDAR data, so that's demonstrating what the elevations are for that part of the model. And then I think if you go to the next slide, it shows what the generated flows are. So this is the floodplain that the model is able to predict for the 100-year flow in the Raisin River just upstream of McGillivrays Bridge. You can see as you drop off from McGillivrays Bridge, Mr. Mayor will recognize this as the McIntyre Rapids. And this is, of course, is a big drop in the river after the bridge, so there's actually less floodplain there, but it's just upstream of that bridge, there's quite a wide floodplain. So that was the modeling exercise the engineering firm did for the Raisin River. That was new updated modeling. Now the St. Lawrence River is slightly different. Municipalities aren't obligated to do the modeling for such a large river, the St. Lawrence River. In fact, it's Environment Canada that has been tasked with that chore. And Environment Canada does maintain the flood elevations, does compute the flood elevations for the St. Lawrence River. And they do have flood elevations for the St. Lawrence River stretching from just upstream of Kingston, from the Lake Ontario, all the way to the Quebec border in our case. And what they've done is they've segmented the St. Lawrence River into multiple segments. In our area, we start at sector 12 and go all the way to sector 31, which is at the Quebec border. And there's a different flood elevation computed for each sector. So if you're between sector 29 and 30, then your flood elevation is this much. And if you're between 30 and 31, then your flood elevation is this much. So Environment Canada is the one that computes those flood elevations. So we use the data from Environment Canada. Next slide. And in conjunction with the LiDAR data. And basically, we're able to turn on all of the cells, all of the high points along the waterfront that correlated to that flood elevation. So if, for example, the flood elevation was at X point X meters, we say, okay, computer, turn on X point X meters, and all of those cells light up, and then the engineering firm was able to then delineate a line around those cells that lit up, because we knew that those cells were below the flood elevation, and that's how the new floodplain has been created. As opposed to in the past, where they would have perhaps only a few known surveyed points, and then somebody would have to interpolate contour lines, and then using the contour lines do some subjective interpretation as to where that flood elevation is. In this case, we're actually saying, okay, we know the flood elevation is at this point. Show me everything that's below that point, and we'll turn it red, and therefore we know that's in the floodplain and needs to be protected.
To help council understand this location, this is the lands, Craig Key is basically in the center. That looks like a white spine. So these would be the lands that would be on east and west of Craig Key.
Yeah, thanks. And then, of course, the question that we get asked all of the time, and it's a good question. And I think every meeting that Joanne and I sit in for pre-consultation, somebody that lives along the St. Lawrence River, well, maybe not every meeting, but it comes up very often, is but the St. Lawrence River is regulated. We're between two dams. How could we possibly flood? And I want to read you the actual response that Environment Canada wrote, because it's very true. So what they say is, it should be noted that during the past 30 years, concentrated efforts have been taken to regulate the levels of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. So we know this. We know all about Plan 2014, and we know that the dam does regulate the flows. Past data and experience combined with modeling techniques have enabled the International Joint Commission's International St. Lawrence River Board of Control to regulate the levels of Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence River system within a limited range of conditions. The impact of this control is reflected in the frequency analysis results upon which the 100-year levels are based. So basically what they're saying is, yes, it is regulated, and that's why the flood elevations are these numbers. These numbers are based on the fact that it is regulated and that we do have this 30 years of regulation under our belt. Many of the factors influencing lake supplies and levels, such as precipitation and wind, cannot be controlled. In addition, future changes in regulation procedures can also impact on levels experienced. And they end with, one must not gain a false sense of security based on levels experienced over the past 30 years. So, in a nutshell, the fact that we are between two dams has absolutely been considered when these flood elevations have been computed and published. I want to talk a little bit more about something Joanne brought up earlier, which is the flood hazard. So the new floodplain maps will be used for zoning purposes, but it should be reiterated that the floodplain is just one element of the flood hazard. The total flooding hazard limit is the sum of the flood limit plus an allowance onshore for other water-related hazards. Now, along the St. Lawrence River, that extra allowance for water-related hazards can vary from 5 to 15 meters. And I'll show you some examples of what those other water-related hazards are. So one of the water-related hazards is wind setup, so flooding due to wind setup. So you may be above the flood elevation, but the wind can actually push the water and raise it, and therefore you're still within a flooding hazard. You have wave uprush, so waves can be generated and go higher than the flood limit, so that's another thing to be considered. And I think we have some examples of waves in our area. So that was a video that was sent to me actually by a resident of Baynesville Bay, and the water wasn't particularly high that day, but it was a nice windy day, and he said, "Oh, Phil, check out the waves today. Isn't it amazing?" And so, and you could clearly see those waves were going over the banks there. So if the water was high and there was those waves, you could see the damage that could possibly have on a home. Perhaps just as significant, we have ice push in our region. So again, these are in our area. A resident submitted these to a colleague of mine at the office, and this is an example of why we perhaps shouldn't build adjacent to the edge of the St. Lawrence River, even if they were above the flood elevation. So the ice, as you know, can be very damaging. So here's a few pictures of what we do see in our region along the St. Lawrence River.
So I want to go back to this slide for a minute. So as Phil mentioned, we meet with quite a few residents. In fact, we require anytime there's new development or redevelopment proposed along a water course, we require what's called a pre-consultation meeting. There's no charge for the residents to come in and meet with us, and we probably 99% of the time ensure that we have an RCA staff member present. And that's because we do very different things as two different organizations. So when you look at the floodplain mapping, and Phil spoke to an additional offset, you could have the extent of the floodplain demonstrated on a map, but that doesn't mean you can build up to that location. So then when we meet with the property owners or developers, we then explain why there has to be an additional offset. And that's something that sometimes people struggle with, or they'll go onto our website and they'll look at our zoning maps and they'll say, okay, well, we can either build into the floodplain or we can go up to the floodplain. So then they're sometimes surprised when they come back and say, when we come back and say there isn't a building envelope here, you can't build. But there's one thing that I wanted to talk about as well that we see often, and with council being our committee of adjustment, you see this on a regular basis. We have a lot of development located in the floodplain on the St. Lawrence River, and that's because our waterfront is almost entirely residentially developed. We have very little public-owned lands, as you are aware, and there's very few properties that are vacant. So just because there's development there, if the development didn't exist today, it doesn't mean the development would be there today. But because we have existing structures, we have to acknowledge those structures, and we call them their grandfathered structures, if you will. And that's why there is a lot of onus put back on the developers to survey their buildings. We ask them to obtain a building location survey, and that would prove where the existing structure is, so that if they move forward with new development or redevelopment, they're either bound to that existing footprint, or they could be subject to a request to reduce, could be various setbacks or a watercourse setback, which we see frequently. When we have development that you've got an existing structure, you'll often hear staff or the Conservation Authority not recommend developments to go closer. And that's one of the reasons why we don't, is because of what, you know, Phil has just demonstrated. And some homeowners come back and tell us they can't get insurance, or, you know, it's too costly, things like that. But you will see us say that it's okay sometimes to extend their footprint, providing the new portion of the structure is not going any closer. So basically they're building within the established line. And that's because we do recognize that it's already developed. And what Phil tries to do is model or determine the risks and mitigate those risks. So you'll see sometimes where staff recommend it not to be approved, or when it is recommended to be approved, we'll often explain why. But you are almost never going to see staff recommend development go closer than 15 meters to a watercourse for vacant land for, you know, what the reasons we're talking about this evening. And we didn't even get into the details of the provincial policy statement and what we're obligated to do. I mean, that wasn't really the purpose of tonight's meeting. It was more to understand our new mapping. But it's not that we want to say no to individuals. It's we want to do the right thing. We want to make the best recommendations as possible. And we are obligated to enforce the policies of the provincial policy statement, our official plan, which is a countywide official plan. And then, of course, we hope that our information that's in our zoning bylaw is implementing those requirements as well as being consistent with. So I'm now going to speak to the next steps, and I'm hoping that council will have lots of questions for us, because we've put a lot of information before you. But the next steps of the process would be for council to receive and file a staff report that I'll speak to the floodplain mapping on, and that's something I'm planning on doing in an upcoming council meeting. That's not necessary, but I feel it's necessary for me or an administration, so that council has an understanding of what our new mapping is going to look like and how we're implementing that new mapping moving forward. We also there's going to be a request to the Raisin Region Conservation Authority Board to accept the floodplain mapping. This is a really important step, because in the official plan, it indicates that any new mapping that has been adopted by the local conservation authority can then be included and implemented without triggering an amendment to the official plan. And that's a great tool in the OP, because it saves a lot of time and money to do an amendment. So one of the reasons why this meeting was timely is for a few reasons. One, I talked about receiving that funding from the federal government to complete the mapping. Our project came in significantly under budget. It was very difficult to estimate the LiDAR acquisition, the modeling. I had mentioned earlier, I believe we had $118,000 in funding, and which represented 49%. Our project came in almost less than half of that, which was fantastic. So it means that council spent, or the township spent less money. It also means that the federal government funded us less money. And the project got a little delayed with COVID. We weren't able to acquire the information as easily. We weren't able to complete the project as quickly as we wanted to. And I would have loved to have had this meeting with council last year. However, we were also into an appeal with our official plan, so there was no point of rushing it. But now we're at the stage where we couldn't wait anymore. And the reason for that is with the I'm going to call it the new county official plan, which was written in 2018 but only approved in 2022 following the appeal. We now have a legislated timeframe to complete our new mapping, and we have to have it done in 3 years, or I shouldn't say our new mapping, our new zoning bylaw, I'm sorry. And so we want to do that as quickly as we can because it's important to be working with the most up-to-date information, and there's going to be improvements made in that zoning bylaw that will help some of our residents in some cases and will also be more up-to-date. So once we've gone to these steps, when we start writing our new zoning bylaw, which is a project for 2023, we'll be able to take this mapping and integrate it into our zoning schedules. But what does that mean to the property owners and the developers in the municipality? And that's what I want council to understand this evening. So I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that we currently ask or provide individuals the opportunity to go out, hire a surveyor, obtain the topographical mapping. That's something they can still do. But with the mapping, we have the LiDAR information with Phil's ability to interpret that information. We can now save our residents a lot of money. And we are in a much better position when we're sitting with individuals, and we've been doing this for quite some time now with this information by saying to them, if you proceed and do your survey, the likelihood of it coming back as helping you, is very low, or, because we have this modeling and you just learned the accuracy of the modeling. And these surveys are, approximately in the $5,000 range for a small lot every time someone wants to do something. Are the residents going to like that answer? They're not going to like that answer. Is it better, thinking back how we were doing it or doing it until we have our new mapping in place, you spend the money and still might get a no, or now are you getting a more of a possible no up front without having to spend the money? And that's where it comes to us in doing our jobs the best way we can in explaining to the residents why, what the recommendation would be, because we're not here to waste people's time and money. And oftentimes there are options in planning, and in our waterfront we have a majority of it being developed. So sometimes the answer is yes and no. Yes, where you can use your existing footprint, but maybe no, you can't get closer for these reasons. So we want to do the best we can in helping the public understand what their constraints may be, what their limitations may be, and what their options are. And I always say in planning, there's often options. It just might not be a cheap path or an easy path, but we are obligated to follow those policies. And Phil, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that in terms of, when we meet with people or what we do, or how it'll impact your permitting on your end, or.
Yeah, no, well, I can say that the LiDAR information has been very useful when we do meet with people, and we are able to show them their property. I mean, it's not always a bad news thing. Sometimes we are able to show them, look, there is a possibility for building at this location. This is what our LiDAR is indicating. If you are going to spend money on a very site-specific survey, we would certainly encourage you to build in this particular area. So the LiDAR has been very useful. It's been a fantastic investment. I think you might be aware that we've actually expanded our LiDAR acquisition for the entire jurisdiction, so that's some other interesting news. But yeah, in this case, I think Joanne said it all.
So when we have our new zoning bylaw presented to the public, and it'll be a fairly detailed public consultation process, we will no longer be recommending that the St. Lawrence River properties that front on the river are in a holding pattern anymore. They will simply be zoned floodplain. There won't be an opportunity for residents to come back and remove that holding and hope that council's going to give them the permission to build or not. It'll be you are inside the floodplain or you are outside the floodplain. And if you are outside the floodplain, you will have an additional setback of 5 or 15 meters. And those setbacks are not negotiable from a permitting or a development perspective. So that's something that I really wanted council to understand, because that could trigger calls, and it's not a huge difference from before, because as I mentioned, sometimes we've had surveys that have come back where they just couldn't move forward, and you may not have received those calls. But because it's going to be a different approach, I think it's, again, important for you to have that knowledge of why we're heading in that direction. So At this time, we want to take questions. If you need us to go back to any slides, certainly let us do so. If you want to present any different scenarios or talk about maybe some different examples that have gone through public processes that you're aware of that you may have didn't understand or had concerns with, certainly this is your time to ask us questions. We still have lots of time in the evening this evening. And following our special meeting of council, we have set up maps on display that council are encouraged to go look at. The maps have just been set up for you to walk through if you wish, and they're maps of the entire Raisin and St. Lawrence system set up in order that would show the before and after so you can understand the impact to properties that are in these locations. So thank you very much for allowing us to present to you.
Thank you both. I believe Councillor Bougie had a question.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm sure, well, I know a lot of work and thought has gone into this presentation. My question is in regards to the different streams. So you'd mentioned there's 4 different streams. This one's mostly stream 2 with the flood mapping. Is there any thought into going into stream 3 with the flood mitigation planning? So like, is there any thought, for instance, we talked about the Raisin River quite a bit, almost yearly McGilvery's road area seems to be flooding. So that mitigation part, is there anything that we can do in the future to maybe mitigate that? Is there any thought into that moving forward?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for your question, Councillor Bougie. So one of the reasons why we chose Stream 2 was because our mapping was out of date. But interestingly enough, we actually didn't even have the flood risk assessment completed to be able to be eligible for Stream 2. So after some convincing to Phil and a lot of late evenings and weekends, I think he pulled together a full risk assessment that would meet the qualifications for us to be eligible to apply for the funding, because we all agreed that step 2 was the most important. To answer your question in regards to step 3 or stream 3 for floodplain mitigation, I think the stream is really helpful for areas that experience a lot more flooding. I'm aware of, for example, some areas in Renfrew County, areas along the Ottawa River system, more west of here, that have taken advantage of that. When you look at the details of that program and the funding that was available at that time, it wasn't worth us investing a lot of dollars when it was something that we could do in-house to be prepared from an emergency planning perspective. So one thing to keep in mind, as much as we were really fortunate to get this funding for this program, the title of the program is National Disaster Mitigation. We are using this program as both mitigation from emergency planning and helping those property owners, as well as from a land use planning perspective. So we've kind of taken the results and morphed it into 2 endpoints. So one of the products of this project that I didn't speak to is we created a specific emergency response plan for flooding. So we've kind of taken that next step to pull in stream 2 or stream 3, I'm sorry, without needing to apply for funding and without needing to spend tax dollars, because we did it internally.
Councillor Jaworski.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor McDonald, thank you very much for the presentation. And I'm very happy to see this coming to fruition. Certainly what we had was out of date. And I think, in the updated, context that we're in terms of climate change, but also how, the property values, what's being built or has been built around, adjacent to water in our area. We've gone from cottages to multi-million-dollar homes. And, one of the big concerns right now in terms of costs going up is insurance costs. And and it is related to things like this, where the cost to rebuild those homes is very high. And when you have these big events, it seems that insurance, on top of that, people are looking to provincial and federal governments to bail out on top of insurance payouts. So I think, it's really important information to have to make sure that we're, that some of these, potential costs aren't transferred on, I guess, to everyone, and to ensure that people are building in places that are less risky. My question has to do with the modeling and the 100-year flood data. Is it a dynamic value in the sense that Because the quote from Environment Canada was from 1993. Is it something that, they're updating it every 5 years based on the last 30 years of data? Or is it a more static value?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. So the answer to the question, is it dynamic or static? Certainly on the Raisin River, it can be dynamic, because that's the floodplain modeling on the Raisin River can be managed and done through the municipality. We have a very good stream gauge on the Raisin River. We would be able to, for example, in 30 years' time, re-examine what the 100-year flood event is based on a statistical analysis of an additional 30 years of data. You're correct. The St. Lawrence River, the quote was from 1993, and in fact, that was the last time that the flood levels were studied on the St. Lawrence River from Environment Canada. Subsequent to that, I think it was 1977, and the 1993 updated the 1977 one. There hasn't been an update since 1993, and I don't know if there is one planned. But I think using the 1993 information is sound. We have done some internal review of how does the past 60 years of data along the St. Lawrence River compare to that 100-year flood elevation. And in fact, we have seen the water level come up to almost that 100-year flood elevation. So I think the 1993 data will be with us for a while. I'm not sure when it's scheduled to be updated, to be honest.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question? If we could go back to the map that is red and yellow, the one that says red represents the new flood, I believe it's, or sorry, is it back from there? Yeah. May have directed you the wrong way. So this one here, is this fairly representative of the outcome of it? I assume green, the small green portion would be removed from the floodplain. As you're saying, the yellow or orange is, sorry, I guess I'm seeing yellow, but it's orange. Orange is the old, red is expanded. Is that fairly typical across? Like, is that a fair representation of the average across this LiDAR work?
Well, I think if we'll be able to see precisely on the boards along the side to see exactly how it has changed and where it has changed. This was a particular example that was highlighted. Just I think perhaps this was perhaps one of the more dynamic ones, or the one where there was more change. So that's why it was selected.
I was going for effect on this slide.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And I had an anecdotal question, because those slides you showed of the Ottawa River, if I remember listening to, and you don't need to show them, it's just the situation was a lot of those residents, they kind of want to live there. They ask councils to, like, let us build there, but like, it's not whether we want to, it's whether we should. And I think that's the fundamental question here, is like, it's nice to let people build close to the water, but should we let them build? Because ultimately, as Councilor Jaworski mentioned, like, where does the risk whenever the flood comes? And if I can borrow some more anecdotal thoughts, as my father would always say, somebody can live there 30 years and say they've never seen a flood like this before, but they'd have to live there 3 times more to be even close to the 100 years to get the high-mark flood. I did see somebody's hand over here tonight. Councilor Jaworski.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor McDonald. My question is, with respect to landowners who may have projects in process, or maybe not, almost in process, formally, informally, where do they fall into this new information?
So that's an excellent question. Thank you. And through you, Mr. Mayor. As Phil has mentioned, we've been using the LiDAR information for quite some time now, because we've actually had that information available to us since the end of 2020. And since the project was completed. So when we're meeting with people, Phil will actually come to every meeting, and if it's not him, it would be one of his staff, but it's generally him, that would show the imaging and explain what we're seeing. So I feel we've done the best we can in the recent past to not encourage costs from property owners, and I think it's been well received. And I don't believe you get a lot of comments or complaints to that effect. So I think we are trying to do the best we can to explain that. So moving forward, though, we obviously haven't met with everybody. And we won't meet with everybody or anybody until they're proposing something new. Or maybe perhaps, let's say, they did something to their property not realizing they needed a permit. And that's when we have those conversations with them. So moving forward, we'll continue meeting with property owners that may not be able to do what they're wanting to do. And this means, though, that we're now having the best information before them. When we do our new zoning bylaw, we're obligated to have open houses and a formal public meeting. I think we have to do a different type of way of communicating our new bylaw to the public this time around, simply because we have a lot more new information that we didn't always have in the past. And if it means having, you know, a few more open houses and, you know, different times of the day or evening, or even a Saturday open house or something, I think we have to do the best we can to let people understand what it means to our waterfront. I don't think there's going to be significant changes in our zoning bylaw in other locations, but again, I'll commit to that to do the best we can when we're communicating. There's one more comment I'd like to make, Mr. Mayor, and if you don't mind, based on your comment previous to Councillor Jaworski's. You'll often see us deal with non-residential structures. So it could be a pool house, it could be a shed, a garage. And I know our Committee of Adjustment has dealt with those applications where there's been recommendations to have these structures, let's say, less than the 15-meter watercourse setback. And maybe Phil can speak to like how we look at those structures a little differently in terms of non-habitable liability and things. We don't let all of them occur, but there's a really serious review that's completed. Not only that, the RCA in their regulations has a requirement to access the waterfront so that repairs can be made to the shoreline, that they can either repair or new shoring can be done. And that's another important conversation that we have with the residents to help them understand why we're so careful on the waterfront and why we're regulating that waterfront. So again, I keep putting you on the spot, Phil, but I know you know the answers.
Yeah, well, I think you talked about why some structures might be allowed to be closer to the water than others. And the answer to that is really, it's in the provincial policy statement, and it has to do with the risk. So what is the risk, and the risk to life and the risk to property damage? So that's something that we balance. Is somebody's life in jeopardy, and is there a large amount of property damage, the dollar amount that could be incurred? So that was why some structures may be allowed closer to the water than others. And another thing that was touched on is this, what the RCA calls an erosion access allowance. So this is an allowance that, kind of a setback, if you will, where people that have waterfront properties, we, as a reviewing agency on behalf of the Ministry of Natural Resources, we review their development proposal and we ask ourselves, does this person have enough shoreline access allowance to be able to bring in suitable machinery if their shoreline was to fail and if they needed to rebuild their shoreline? So that's why sometimes we will require a side setback that's bigger than your normal side yard setback, and that allowance is to allow for heavy equipment, suitably sized equipment, to come in and repair the shoreline if need be, because unfortunately we're not allowed to rely on agreements that people may have with their neighbors, saying, well, my neighbor will let me drive my skid steer down and fix the shoreline if need be, because once something is built, properties change hands, and 30 years from now, we could be liable for allowing something to be built contrary to the technical standards, and that's something that we're trying to avoid. So that's one of the access allowances that we often insist on for shoreline development.
Thank you, Councillor McAdell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, thanks for the presentation. And I guess it was just something along that same vein, actually. But something Miss Haley had mentioned earlier. Are you saying that from the 100-year flood level, we have 5 to 15 meters of setback? You're saying that, like, historically, we have allowed development residential side, so I'm understanding that, say it's a pool house or a sunshade or something along those lines, there's special exceptions we'll make, but from time to time, we've done, like, the addition on a house is encroaching on the, say it's 13 and a half meters from that line. Are we still gonna have the right to allow those as a committee of adjustment, even if it's, like we've done it in the past where it's not recommended by staff and the RRCA to approve it, but it is a very small amount or of, say, overrun or closer to the river? Are we still gonna have that right as a committee of adjustment or council?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I think that's a really good question. So first of all, when we meet with individuals, we do a review to determine if it's something that we can support. And again, we do that review with the RCA staff, and they will look to determine if that additional, addition, I should say, is going to further impact the, either the water itself or the waterfront, or if where that proposed structure is going to be is more of a liability, if you will. So if that review comes back where no, we think it's something we can support, then I believe you still will have that opportunity from the Committee of Adjustment perspective. I'm not aware of any proposed changes to the provincial policy or to our official plan that would mitigate that. I mean, the policy from the provincial policy statement is not in our control, so we never know what could be coming down the road, but I'm not aware of something being proposed in the near future to that effect. And also, I believe we need to be consistent with how we rewrite our new zoning bylaw so that we're still recognizing grandfathered rights, we're still recognizing those existing structures. And if we have opportunities to allow people to build within that established building line, so to use your example of, if their structure is already 13.5 meters setback and they want to widen their dwelling by 7 feet, well, is 7 more feet of structure going to impact the watercourse, or is the watercourse going to impact the structure? And if the answer is no, it'll still be the same. I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that from a regulation perspective. I will just finish by saying though, we're writing this zoning bylaw internally. We'll be working with council to let you know what has to change. And in my opinion, if we're not told to change that by the province, then I will be looking for consistencies from previous bylaws. It's difficult to have vast differences in bylaws because then you start treating people very differently, and that then becomes an issue.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add other than having this updated flood mapping and having the updated zoning will provide consistency. Additionally, having a zoning bylaw update, that'll also provide consistency. You marry that with the RRCA, we've recently updated our regulation policies. So now those 3 elements work together for consistent decisions when it comes to land use planning. And it will be to the point where somebody can come into a pre-consultation meeting and pretty much know the answer as they're coming in, and know that they're not getting special treatment, or know that their neighbor's not getting special treatment. There are some cases, I don't want to confuse the zoning bylaw between building close to water and building close to floodplain. So the bylaw, there's a bylaw, a zoning bylaw that says you must be 30 meters back from the top of bank. And oftentimes you will, as a committee of adjustment, will see that minor variance request come in for something less than 30 meters. That's not to be confused with what we're doing today, which is looking at the actual floodplain zoning and saying, regardless of whether you're 30 meters or more from the top of bank, if you're in a floodplain, it's still too dangerous to build in that floodplain. So that's what we're looking at today.
And just to add to that, Mr. Mayor, this additional 5 to 15 meters is something that's been implemented for years internally. This may not be obvious to council, so it's not new when we're dealing with the public. And we actually had a couple of options that we've debated. We could choose to zone the property, the floodplain, plus an additional 15 meters where no development occur, or we can simply zone the floodplain and allow the RCA to do a proper review to then give people that option. And we are recommending that we do the latter, what I just explained, because it's a much more common sense approach. It's looking at each property properly, and it's not over-regulating, if you will.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no, thank you for the answer on that, and I guess that was kind of where I was going with this as well, was I just hope we're not gonna put a hard line at that 15 meter, or even at 6 meters or something like that, because it eats up a lot of property in a hurry, and as you've kind of explained, there are common sense areas, like, for example, I can think of one along the St. Lawrence at the very east end where you could be 30 meters from top of bank, and you will still have, on a windy day, water hitting the home. And you have other spots where you could be 4.5 meters from top of bank, and you'll never see water come up. And they're at the same elevation, it's just the orientation of the home towards, or to what direction it's pointing. If it's pointing straight west, a strong west wind it'll cover the other side of the road with water, as opposed to like a direction facing straight south or even east into the point. So it was just that there is space for common sense approach with this line, without still, again, having to cause people to, if there's a common sense approach that can allow somebody to say, okay, I don't feel I have to spend that 5,000 on a topo to prove I can do it, or it looks obvious enough to me in this, I can still live within that 15 meters. Sometimes it gives us that grace that it can make somebody's project happen and not cause them to go and spend money they don't have to. So I appreciate that.
Councilor Jaworski, and then Deputy Mayor Lang.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor McDonald. We've spoken very much about residential construction and building. Does this data change anything in terms of other uses, like agricultural use, or, for example?
So I'll start by answering a portion of that question. So when we look at policies, it speaks to structures. It doesn't necessarily get into how those structures are occupied. When it comes to agricultural activities don't need a permit, generally don't need a permit. So they wouldn't be dealing with me, let's say, for permission to plant corn or to go from corn to beans or whatever it may be. So I don't see that from a zoning perspective. However, I'm now going to turn to the RCA because it might be a little different from a regulation perspective on, filling or altering that land.
The short answer is no, it won't change for agriculture. Whether it's floodplain or not, we still have regulation policies, and we have a section in our policies for agriculture, and that won't change because of this mapping. It'll be the same policies.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. Although, Phil, I'm just going off of what Stephanie said, if the agriculture was to want to clear the land within certain distance of the floodplain to farm it, then they do have to have permits, do they not? If they're going to be doing clearing and this sort of thing?
I have to be careful.
Well, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I just
yeah.
thought that we did
No,
have to have a
so-
permit to do clearing within a certain distance of the floodplain.
Within certain distance, certain development activities will require a permit, whether it's agriculture or residential or commercial. And so our policies aren't changing. It would still be the same policies.
That wasn't my question anyway, but,
Can
so the flood, go
Can I
ahead.
add to that if you don't mind, and I apologize for interrupting? That's how we're currently operating, and that's why Phil's saying it's not going to change, because there's policies that speak to no site alteration or development in a floodplain. And so that's not changing at all, and I don't believe we're proposing to change, any of those regulations, because we're obligated to follow what's indicated in the provincial policy statement and other regulations. So that, I believe, will remain status quo. So you will often hear both offices say this cannot be done for these reasons because you're in a floodplain. So
And that's kind of where my question was going, was along those lines, not to do with farming though. But the floodplain is obviously an elevation thing for the most part. So what are, if there are, the site alterations to me could be bringing in fill, raising the level, and then you're out of the floodplain, and then is there the means for the people to be able to maybe possibly build if they can get a permit to change the elevation?
Thanks. Yes. So um, this is really a planning question, and planning. I'm an engineer, but planners have this this hierarchy of how things ought to be done. So there's the whole principle of development and the planning behind that, and when should you apply for a permit and when should you not apply for a permit, and certain permits don't require a Planning Act application. So you don't necessarily need a minor variance or a site plan or a zoning amendment to do certain activities. And in those activities where you don't need a minor variance or a site plan, or there's no Planning Act requirement involved, then we look at the RRCA's regulatory role. And the RRCA has, so the RRCA does wear two hats. We wear one hat on behalf of the province, so whenever we're looking at Planning Act applications, whenever we're looking at a minor variance or something within the floodplain that needs a municipal approval, we represent the province and we have to be in line with the province's provincial policy statement. If there's not a Planning Act approval required, then the RRCA wears the hat of the Conservation Authorities Act. And the Conservation Authorities Act has regulations that are in place to control flooding and erosion and prevent development on hazardous lands. And those regulations have with them a set of policies. And those policies are board approved. And there are some policies that will allow for small amounts of fill to be brought in if in the event there is a floodplain on the property. So at that point, it wouldn't be necessarily a municipal question. It would come to the Conservation Authority, and they could come to the Conservation Authority and sit with us, and we could discuss a Conservation Authority Act permit, and we would look at our regulations, and we would see if what it is that they're proposing is in line with those regulations, and if we'd be able to support the permit or not in that case.
All right, are there any further questions or comments or additions to the presentation, or we are good to wrap this up? Okay, great. Oh, Joanne, you want to make a closing, or sorry, Ms. Haley, would you like to make a closing statement?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, I just wanted to thank you again for allowing us to have this special meeting of council, and thank you to Phil for helping put this presentation together. We also have two employees here this evening that helped as well, being Anne Lalonde and Max Irwin. So I've asked them to attend this evening. They helped with the mapping, pulling it together and setting up this evening. And it is a big project, and it takes a lot of effort, and it'll be something that we'll continue to work with in the near and long-term future to get incorporated into our new bylaws. So we'll always be here to answer any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Okay, well, then I guess thank you, Mr. Irwin and Ms. Lalonde, as well yourself, Mr. Barnes, and Ms. Haley for all that work. We have 95% compliance on our applications at the RRCA. I just thought that would be a fun thing to throw in there while you're here. So most small conservations are about 93%, and I understand there's somebody in and around the area that's about 86%. So we're a local leader with our applications, getting them out there. So all these conversations come back to fueling those applications to make it more efficient. So I wanted to highlight that from the RRCA. They do an excellent job on our behalf. And thank you, Ms. Haley, for your presentation and all your team's work for this. So I will then call this meeting to adjourn. So moved by Stephanie Jaworski, seconded by Sam McDonnell. Be it resolved that the Council of the Township of South Glengarry adjourn to the call of the chair at 6:21 p.m. All those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, carried. Suppose that's the end of our meeting. So everyone who watched, have a